I almost got arrested for trespassing on my own property. This HOA Karen called the cops because I refused to join her fake homeowners association. But she didn't know one thing about me. I was actually her landlord. Drop a comment below, have you ever dealt with an HOA nightmare? Subscribe to Black Stories Uncut 29. The morning mist was still dancing across Clearwater Lake when I first laid eyes on paradise again. After 20 years in military logistics bouncing between dusty forward operating bases from Afghanistan to Iraq, I'd finally come home to the cabin my grandfather left me. The smell of pine mixed with fresh coffee from my thermos, and somewhere in the distance a loon called across the water like nature's own reveille. This wasn't just a house. It was my sanctuary, my piece of the American dream that nobody could take away. Or so I thought before I met Brenda Carmichael. I was standing on my dock testing the old fishing rod Grandpa had carved by hand in 1987 when I heard the electric hum of a golf cart approaching. The vehicle was pristine white, matching the spotless capri pants and oversized sunglasses of the woman driving it. She had that particular brand of suburban authority that screams middle management meets country club with a clipboard that looked more dangerous than any weapon I'd encountered overseas. Her blonde hair was shellacked into submission, and she wore the kind of smile that politicians perfect right before they raise your taxes. Good morning, I'm Brenda Carmichael, president of the Clearwater Lake Estates Homeowners Association, she announced, stepping out of her cart with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. I need to discuss some community standards violations with you, Mr. Thornfield. Your property is currently non-compliant with our aesthetic guidelines, and you haven't paid your mandatory HOA dues. The fine print on her citation showed a laundry list of infractions from grass height exceeding regulation 2 inches to unauthorized dock improvements and fishing activities outside designated hours. The total penalty was $1,200 due within 14 days. I looked at the paper, then back at her perfectly manicured nails drumming impatiently on her clipboard. Ma'am, with all due respect, I don't recall signing up for any HOA when I inherited this place. My grandfather built this cabin in 1987, and he was pretty particular about keeping his property rights intact. She laughed that special laugh that certain people use when they think you're too stupid to understand how the world really works. Oh honey, property ownership comes with responsibilities to the community. Your grandfather's old agreements don't override current standards. We're trying to maintain property values here, not run some backwoods fishing camp. That's when my neighbors, Tom and Maria Rodriguez, started edging closer to their fence line, pretending to water plants while obviously eavesdropping. Tom was a retired machinist built like a fire hydrant, with hands that could fix anything and a bullshit detector that rarely failed him. Maria taught 3rd grade for 30 years. And had that teacher's instinct for spotting troublemakers from 50 yards away. They'd been dealing with Brenda's harassment campaign for 6 months, getting fined for everything from leaving their garbage cans out past pickup time to having the wrong shade of beige on their shutters. The whole neighborhood was walking on eggshells, afraid to sneeze, without checking Brenda's ever-changing rulebook first. I studied the citation more carefully, noting the fuzzy HOA logo that looked like it was printed on a home inkjet printer, the lack of any official seal, and a business address that seemed suspiciously generic. This woman was either running the most unprofessional HOA in America, or something else entirely was going on. Look, Miss Carmichael, I said, folding the paper carefully, I'm going to need to review my property documents before I acknowledge any violations. As a veteran, I've learned to read the fine print on everything, especially when someone shows up at my door demanding money. She bristled at that, her fake smile cracking just enough to show the steel underneath. Mr. Thornfield, I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation. Non-compliance results in escalating penalties, potential liens against your property, and if necessary, legal action. We have authority granted by the county to enforce community standards, and I suggest you don't test our resolve. The way she said authority made my military training kick in. Something about her tone, her body language, the whole performance felt rehearsed, like she'd delivered this exact speech to dozens of other homeowners. I thanked her politely, promised to review everything thoroughly, and watched her drive away in that silent electric cart, already plotting her next victim. After she left, I walked back into the cabin and headed straight for Grandpa's old steel strongbox, the one he'd installed behind a false panel in the basement wall. Inside were the original property documents, yellowed with age but still legally binding. The deed from 1987 was crystal clear, recorded with the county clerk and notarized by 3 different witnesses. Most importantly, there wasn't a single mention of any homeowners association, covenant, or restriction. Grandpa had specifically fought the original developer to keep his property free and clear of any association agreements, knowing that once you give up those rights, you never get them back. Brenda Carmichael wasn't just wrong about the HOA requirements. She was running some kind of elaborate scam, and I was about to find out just how deep this rabbit hole went. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office with a mission. Dolores Martinez had been working the public records desk for 30 years, and she knew every property dispute, boundary disagreement, and bureaucratic maze in 3 counties. Her desk looked like a monument to organized chaos, with manila folders stacked in towers that defied gravity and a computer system that predated the internet by at least a decade. When I explained what I was looking for, her eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting her whole career for a good mystery to solve. "Oh, honey," she said, pulling out a thick folder marked Clearwater Lake Estates. "You're not the first person to ask about this HOA situation. I've had 12 different homeowners in here over the past 6 months, all with the same story. Citations, fines, threats of liens, the whole 9 yards. But here's the thing," and she leaned in conspiratorially, "there's no registered homeowners association for your area. Never has been. What I found in the public records was even more interesting than I'd expected. Brenda had incorporated something called Clearwater Management LLC just 6 months ago, but it had no legal authority to act as an HOA. More damning, her lakeside mansion was operating as an unlicensed short-term rental, violating both zoning laws and the new state regulations designed to address the housing crisis. The timing couldn't have been worse for Brenda's Airbnb operation. With the Biden administration cracking down on housing speculation and states implementing stricter short-term rental laws, her little side business was suddenly facing potential fines of up to $50,000. That kind of money might explain why she was so desperate to squeeze fees out of the neighborhood homeowners. Dolores printed out copies of every relevant document, including business registration papers that showed Brenda owing back taxes and facing multiple civil judgments. This wasn't just about fake HOA fines anymore. This was about someone drowning in debt and trying to scam her way out. Armed with this information, I called an emergency meeting at Tom and Maria's house that evening. We gathered around their kitchen table, the same one where Maria had graded thousands of homework assignments over the years, and I laid out everything I'd discovered. Tom studied the documents with the methodical attention of someone who'd spent his career reading technical blueprints, while Maria took notes in the neat handwriting that had corrected countless spelling mistakes. We decided to form what we jokingly called the Truth Squad, a neighborhood investigation team dedicated to documenting every aspect of Brenda's operation. Our first recruit was Janet Morrison, the town librarian who lived 3 houses down from me. Janet was 42, widowed for 5 years, with auburn hair that caught the light just right and a smile that made even the most complicated research projects seem manageable. She'd been getting citations for having the wrong type of flowers in her front yard, apparently violating some aesthetic standard that existed only in Brenda's imagination. Janet brought something invaluable to our group, a researcher's instinct for finding information that most people would never think to look for. Within hours, she'd uncovered Brenda's social media profiles, business listings, and a trail of complaints from previous neighborhoods where similar scams had been attempted. But Brenda wasn't going to take our investigation lying down. When word got back to her that I'd been asking questions at the county office, she launched what could only be described as a harassment campaign. First came the code enforcement complaints, claiming my cabin was structurally unsafe and needed immediate inspection. Then she started posting on the neighborhood Facebook page, painting me as an outside agitator who was trying to destroy property values and community standards. The posts were expertly crafted, playing on people's fears about declining home values and uncontrolled development. She even managed to get a few neighbors to voice support for stronger community oversight. The breaking point came when she called the sheriff's department, claiming there was a suspicious person lurking around the lake, possibly casing houses for burglary. I was sitting on my own dock, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise when Deputy Sarah Chen pulled up in her patrol car. Deputy Chen was former military herself, and after a brief conversation, she realized that Brenda's call was completely fabricated. But the fact that someone was willing to waste police resources on false reports showed just how desperate the situation was becoming. This wasn't neighborhood politics anymore. This was approaching criminal harassment. That's when I decided to go public. I set up my phone camera on the dock with the morning light reflecting off the lake behind me and recorded a 15-minute video explaining everything we discovered. I showed the original deed, the fake citations, the public records proving no HOA existed, and the evidence of Brenda's unlicensed business operations. Within 6 hours of posting it to the neighborhood Facebook group, the video had over 1,500 views and dozens of comments from neighbors sharing their own experiences with Brenda's scam. The tide was starting to turn, but I had no idea that Brenda was about to escalate things to a completely different level. Tom knocked on my door that evening with news that made my blood run cold. His cousin worked for code enforcement, and word was spreading through official channels that someone had been making generous donations to certain commissioners in exchange for favorable treatment of complaints. The corruption wasn't limited to fake HOA fines. This was about someone systematically buying influence in local government, turning public servants into private enforcers. We weren't just fighting one delusional neighbor anymore. We were up against a conspiracy that reached into the very offices that were supposed to protect us. And if we were going to win this fight, we'd need evidence that even the most corrupt official couldn't ignore. Code enforcement arrived at my property on a Tuesday morning, 3 vehicles deep, like they were raiding a drug laboratory instead of inspecting a lakeside cabin that had passed every safety check for 37 years. Tom Ramirez, the lead inspector, looked embarrassed before he even got out of his truck. He'd been doing this job for 15 years and prided himself on following regulations to the letter, but something about this particular complaint didn't smell right. The anonymous tip described structural violations that simply didn't exist, safety hazards that anyone with eyes could see weren't there, and zoning infractions that made no sense for a property that had been grandfathered in a década. Tom walked through the cabin with professional thoroughness, checking every beam joint and electrical connection, while his partners waited outside looking increasingly uncomfortable. After 45 minutes, he pulled me aside with the kind of expression that usually preceded very bad news or very good news, depending on which side of the law you were standing on. "Mr. Thornfield," he said quietly, "in 15 years of doing this job, I've never seen a complaint this far off base. Whoever reported this either has never seen your property or they were deliberately lying. That's not just unprofessional, it's potentially criminal misuse of government resources. Between you and me, someone called in a lot of favors to get this inspection fast-tracked. That afternoon, I called my old Army buddy Dave Mitchell, who'd transitioned from military intelligence to working as a private investigator, specializing in corporate fraud and insurance scams. Dave had that particular set of skills that made him invaluable in situations exactly like this. The ability to gather information that technically wasn't secret, but wasn't exactly advertised either. Within 24 hours, he'd compiled a dossier on Brenda that read like a case study in financial desperation. She owed $68,000 in credit card debt, had 2 civil judgments against her for unpaid contractor bills, and was facing foreclosure on her primary residence in the next 90 days. The lakeside mansion wasn't her home, it was a rental property where she was running an illegal Airbnb operation to generate cash flow. But the real breakthrough came when Dave started following Brenda's movements around town. Using a combination of public surveillance cameras and old-fashioned detective work, he documented a series of meetings between Brenda and Commissioner Robert Hayes at Luigi's restaurant downtown. The conversations were too far away to hear, but the body language was unmistakable, and the envelope that changed hands certainly wasn't a birthday card. Dave managed to get close enough during their 3rd meeting to capture audio, and what we heard changed everything. $20,000 to make Marcus Thornfield's life difficult to find violations where none existed, and to expedite any complaints against his property. This wasn't just corruption, it was conspiracy. The situation took a darker turn when Brenda decided that legal harassment wasn't working fast enough. Someone cut the anchor line on my fishing boat during the night, sending it drifting into the rocky shallows, where the hull was damaged beyond repair. The boat had belonged to my grandfather, hand-built from local cedar, and maintained with the kind of care that only comes from true love of craftsmanship. The monetary damage was $3,500, pushing the crime into felony territory, but the emotional impact was incalculable. This wasn't about HOA violations anymore. This was about someone trying to destroy the last connections I had to my family history. Fortunately, I'd installed security cameras around the property after the first few incidents, military habits dying hard when it comes to perimeter security. The footage was crystal clear, showing 2 men in dark clothing approaching the dock at 2 in the morning, cutting the anchor line and pushing the boat toward the rocks. More importantly, their vehicle was visible in the frame license plate clearly readable, and one of the men's faces was caught in the infrared illumination. When I delivered the footage to Deputy Chen, she immediately recognized one of the perpetrators as someone with a long history of being hired for odd jobs by people who didn't want to get their own hands dirty. The community response to the boat sabotage was swift and decisive. Tom Rodriguez organized a neighborhood watch patrol that operated around the clock with volunteers taking shifts to monitor suspicious activity. Maria started a phone tree that could alert everyone within 5 minutes if anything unusual was spotted. Janet created a shared online document where neighbors could report incidents and track patterns of harassment. What had started as Brenda's attempt to divide and intimidate the community was having exactly the opposite effect, bringing people together in ways that hadn't happened since the neighborhood was first built. The wire operation came together through a combination of careful planning and incredible luck. Dave's contact in the FBI had been investigating public corruption in the county for months, and Commissioner Hayes was already on their radar for several suspicious contracts and zoning decisions. When they learned about Brenda's bribery attempts, they saw an opportunity to gather evidence that could bring down the entire network. Inspector Carl Hendricks, who worked closely with Hayes on construction permits, agreed to wear a recording device during his next contact with Brenda. The setup was professional-grade equipment, virtually undetectable, and capable of capturing hours of conversation with courtroom-quality clarity. The recorded conversation was 47 minutes of pure gold for prosecutors. Brenda not only admitted to creating the fake HOA and extorting neighbors, but she outlined her entire plan to acquire lakefront property through harassment and legal manipulation. She described how she intended to force longtime residents to sell their homes below market value, then flip them to developers for luxury vacation rentals. The conversation included specific details about which officials had been bribed, how much money changed hands, and what future considerations had been promised. Most damning of all, she discussed her plans to expand the operation to other lakes in the region, creating a systematic program of real estate fraud. But as the pressure mounted, Brenda's behavior became increasingly erratic and dangerous. She started showing up at local businesses, loudly accusing me of being everything from a terrorist sympathizer to a communist infiltrator sent to destroy American property values. The rants were captured on multiple cell phone cameras and quickly went viral on social media, but they also revealed someone who was losing touch with reality. When she posted a Facebook video threatening to burn down my cabin and restore proper order to the neighborhood, she crossed the line from harassment into domestic terrorism. In the post, the 6th of January environment, law enforcement takes those kinds of threats very seriously, and Brenda suddenly found herself under federal investigation for multiple felonies. The woman who thought she could intimidate her way to easy money was about to learn that justice sometimes comes with compound interest. The call came at 6 in the morning on a Thursday, jarring me awake with that particular ringtone I had assigned to emergency contacts. It was Janet, and her voice carried the kind of excitement that comes with discovering something that changes everything. "Marcus, you need to get over here right now. I found something in the historical property records that you're not going to believe." The town library had recently digitized decades of old documents, including property transfers, estate settlements, and trust agreements that hadn't been easily accessible to the public until now. Janet had been working late cross-referencing property ownership records when she stumbled across a document that made her heart skip a beat. The Thornfield Family Trust, established in 1985, controlled significantly more property around Clearwater Lake than anyone had realized. My grandfather hadn't just owned the cabin where I lived. He'd been systematically acquiring lakefront parcels over the course of 20 years, quietly building a portfolio that included nearly 60% of the valuable shoreline properties. The trust document, thick as a phone book and written in the kind of legal language that requires a decoder ring, listed properties by lot number and legal description rather than street address. It took Janet 3 hours with a county map to figure out exactly what my family owned, and the results were staggering. Among the trust holdings was a property listed as Parcel 47B Lakeshore Drive, a 5-bedroom mansion with private dock and guest cottage. According to the property records, it had been leased on a long-term basis to generate income for the trust, with rental payments going into an account managed by the Bank of Clearwater. I'd been receiving quarterly statements from that account for years without really paying attention, assuming they were just dividends from Grandpa's old stock investments. The current lessee of record was listed as B. Carmichael, with a lease agreement dating back 18 months and a security deposit of $12,000. The lease terms were standard for a high-end property, but they included several clauses that Brenda had been systematically violating. No commercial use without written permission, no subletting or short-term rental arrangements, maintenance of property in good condition, respect for community harmony and neighborly relations. Each violation carried specific penalties, and after 3 violations, the lease could be terminated with 30 days' notice. A quick review of the evidence we'd gathered showed at least 14 clear breaches of contract, any one of which would be grounds for eviction in a normal landlord-tenant relationship. But the real shock came when I cross-referenced the rental payment history with Brenda's harassment campaign timeline. She'd stopped paying rent 4 months ago, exactly when the fake HOA citations started appearing in everyone's mailboxes. Her Airbnb operation had been running out of my property for 6 months, generating income that should have been going toward her rent obligations. The woman who'd been terrorizing the neighborhood with threats of liens and legal action was actually squatting in my family's property while running an illegal business out of it. The irony was so perfect it felt like something out of a bad movie, except the consequences were very real for everyone involved. I spent the rest of that day consulting with the trust attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Williams, who specialized in estate law and had been handling my family's affairs since before I was born. Patricia took one look at the evidence and smiled the kind of smile that strikes fear into the hearts of opposing counsel everywhere. "Marcus," she said, "this is what we call an open and shut case. Not only is she in breach of contract, but the illegal business operation and harassment of other tenants gives us grounds for immediate eviction. We can file the papers tomorrow and have her out in 30 days. But given the criminal charges she's facing, I suspect she won't contest it." The timing was crucial because Brenda's federal investigation was escalating rapidly. The FBI had been building a case against Commissioner Hayes for months, and Brenda's recorded admissions provided the missing pieces they needed to pursue RICO charges against the entire corruption network. Her threats against my property, combined with the bribery evidence and the domestic terrorism implications of her social media posts, meant she was looking at potential federal prison time. The woman who thought she could intimidate her way to easy money was about to discover that the justice system has a long memory and very little tolerance for people who abuse public trust. Word of the ownership revelation spread through the neighborhood faster than a wildfire in dry grass. Tom and Maria were the first to hear the full story, and Tom's reaction was exactly what I'd expected from a man who'd spent his career working with precision machinery. He looked at the documents, nodded slowly, and said, "Well, that explains why she never wanted anyone looking too closely at property records. She knew if people started asking questions, the whole house of cards would come tumbling down." Maria's teacher instincts kicked in immediately, and she started organizing a neighborhood meeting to discuss how to handle the situation going forward. The community response was overwhelmingly supportive, but it came with an interesting twist. Several neighbors admitted they'd been considering selling their homes because of Brenda's harassment, fearing that property values would decline if the HOA disputes continued. Now that the truth was out, property values were actually likely to increase, especially once the illegal short-term rental operation was shut down, and the area returned to being a quiet, residential neighborhood. People started talking about organizing legitimate community activities, maybe an annual lake cleanup day or a neighborhood barbecue, the kind of organic social organization that brings people together instead of driving them apart. Janet and I had grown closer during the investigation, sharing late-night research sessions and early morning strategy meetings that gradually evolved into something more personal. She had a way of explaining complex legal documents that made them sound like interesting stories rather than boring paperwork, and I found myself looking forward to our conversations about property law and community organizing. When I told her about the trust revelation, she looked at me with those bright green eyes and said, "You know what this means, don't you? You have the power to create the kind of neighborhood you actually want to live in. That's not just ownership, that's responsibility." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Dave delivered his complete investigation report. Brenda's financial situation was even worse than we'd initially discovered. She owed money to loan sharks, had defaulted on multiple credit cards, and was facing bankruptcy within the next 60 days. The lakeside mansion was her last-ditch attempt to generate enough cash flow to avoid complete financial ruin, but her illegal activities had made the situation exponentially worse. She wasn't just facing eviction and criminal charges, she was looking at the complete collapse of everything she'd been trying to save. In trying to steal from her neighbors, she'd managed to destroy her own life in the most spectacular way possible. The monthly town hall meeting was usually a sleepy affair, maybe 30 people discussing road maintenance and library funding in the high school gymnasium. But word had spread about the HOA scandal, the corruption investigation, and the promised revelations that would finally explain months of neighborhood chaos. By 7 o'clock, the gym was packed with nearly 200 people, folding chairs arranged in rows like a courtroom with local news cameras set up in the back and a tension in the air that felt electric. I'd spent days preparing for this moment, organizing documents and evidence into a presentation that would tell the complete story without getting bogged down in legal technicalities. The PowerPoint slides were simple and clear, starting with the fake HOA citations and building methodically through the investigation, the corruption evidence, and finally the ownership revelations that tied everything together. Patricia Williams sat in the front row, legal documents ready for what we'd planned as the evening's dramatic conclusion. Commissioner Hayes wasn't in attendance, which everyone in the room understood meant he was probably meeting with FBI agents and criminal defense attorneys. His absence spoke louder than any speech could have, a visual reminder that corruption eventually catches up with even the most carefully protected officials. The current acting commissioner, a soft-spoken woman named Linda Park, had promised full cooperation with both the criminal investigation and the civil proceedings that would determine Brenda's fate. When I stood up to address the crowd, the gymnasium fell silent with the kind of attention usually reserved for emergency announcements or graduation speeches. I started with the morning 6 months ago when Brenda first appeared on my dock, explaining how her fake HOA citations had seemed like a minor annoyance at first. The audience murmured sympathetically as I described the escalating harassment, the illegal business operation, and the systematic corruption that had turned local government into a personal enforcement service for someone drowning in debt. The revelation about the Thornfield Trust ownership brought audible gasps from the crowd. People turned to look at each other, connecting dots they hadn't even known, existed understanding for the first time how completely they'd been manipulated by someone who was essentially squatting on stolen property while extorting money from legitimate homeowners. When I played the audio recordings of Brenda bribing Commissioner Hayes, the silence was so complete you could have heard a pin drop on the gymnasium floor. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. I nodded to Patricia Williams, who stood up with a folder containing legal documents that would change everything. Ladies and gentlemen, I announced as the lawful owner of the property currently occupied by Brenda Carmichael and given her multiple violations of lease terms, criminal activities conducted on the premises, and continued harassment of community members, I am hereby serving 30 days' notice of eviction. The gymnasium erupted in applause that went on for nearly 3 minutes, a standing ovation that felt like justice finally being served. Brenda wasn't in attendance that evening, but her lawyer was a nervous young man who looked like he was reconsidering his career choices with each new piece of evidence presented. After the meeting, he approached me privately and indicated that his client would not contest the eviction, would cooperate fully with the criminal investigation, and was hoping to negotiate a plea agreement that would allow her to avoid federal prison time. The fight was over before it had really begun, ended not by violence or intimidation, but by the simple power of truth and legal documentation. The aftermath moved quickly. Brenda vacated the lakeside mansion within 2 weeks, leaving behind a property that needed significant cleaning and repairs but was fundamentally sound. The illegal Airbnb operation was shut down immediately, and the property was listed with a legitimate rental management company that specialized in long-term leases to responsible tenants. The neighborhood slowly returned to the peaceful lake community it had been before Brenda's reign of terror began. Commissioner Hayes eventually pled guilty to multiple corruption charges and was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, along with full restitution to the taxpayers whose trust he'd violated. The FBI investigation expanded to include several other county officials, leading to a comprehensive cleanup of local government that made national news as an example of how citizen action can expose and eliminate institutional corruption. The neighborhood organized itself into a voluntary community association, the kind of genuine grassroots organization that brings people together instead of driving them apart. We instituted an annual lake cleanup day, monthly potluck dinners, and a scholarship fund in my grandfather's memory for local students pursuing careers in public service or environmental protection. Tom became the association's first president. Maria handled communications, and Janet organized the community activities that helped neighbors become genuine friends. Janet and I started dating officially About 2 months after the town hall meeting, taking long walks around the lake and discovering that our shared experience fighting corruption had created something deeper than just friendship. She moved into the cabin the following spring, bringing her extensive library and her talent for making any place feel like home. We talked about the future, about the kind of community we wanted to help build, about the responsibility that comes with having the power to make positive change. Looking back, the whole experience taught me something important about America in 2025. We're facing challenges that seem overwhelming, from political polarization to economic inequality to the erosion of trust in public institutions. But at the local level, where neighbors know each other's names and community still means something ordinary, people can still make extraordinary differences. You don't need special powers or political connections. You just need to be willing to do the research, document the truth, and stand up for what's right. The most satisfying part wasn't seeing Brenda face consequences for her actions, though justice certainly felt good after months of harassment and intimidation. The real victory was watching our neighborhood transform from a collection of isolated households living in fear into a genuine community where people looked out for each other. That's the America worth fighting for, the one that exists not in political speeches or social media posts, but in the quiet moments when neighbors help neighbors and everyone has a stake in making things better. If this story resonates with you, I'd love to hear about your own experiences dealing with difficult neighbors, local corruption, or community organizing efforts. Your stories matter, and they might help someone else facing similar challenges. Don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Uncut 29 for more real stories about ordinary people standing up to extraordinary circumstances. Each story we tell builds a stronger community of truth seekers who refuse to let bullies and scammers win. Together, we're proving that justice isn't just an ideal, it's something we create through courage, persistence, and the power of documentation.